This panel essentially comes out of some interminable meetings that I've sat through, and several of us have at ADI, ACSA, the Wine and Spirits Wholesalers Association, going on about how do we define craft. It's a question that's just been really persistent. It's not just to spirits. It's something that's been in craft brewing for years. Even you get to arts versus crafts in the 19th century. People have been debating on what is craft forever. And I think that this is a rabbit hole we probably prefer not to go down today. I don't think we're going to try to define it. I've come away from those meetings thinking that the question is fine, how do we define craft, but the emphasis is wrong. It shouldn't be on craft, it should be on we, on who is doing the defining when we're talking about that. I mean, at these meetings, people would stand up and talk about what they, how they define craft. Some bought barrels of whiskey and blended them, and they thought that was their craft. Others used a pot still, like the ancients, and said that if you're not using a pot still, it's not craft. Actually, one of those who made that claim was Tito Beverage, who makes Tito's vodka. There are proposals to define it on the size of production, on who owned it, on how much the product changed from the time it went in the front door to the time it came out the back door. All were pretty reasonable definitions, but and you could make a defense of any of them, but none of these were really definitive or comprehensive, and it was clear that the craft producers and the regulators, whether it's ADI, ACSA, or TTB, were never really going to reach a point where they could define craft. What it came down to is everyone would stand up at these meetings, say, here's what I do, this is craft. And it was just all over the map. And I really don't think we're ever going to define craft, and I don't see there's much point in it, just like trying to define natural in the food world, all natural. It's elusive, and if you do define it, have some either regulatory or industry group define it, people will just find other ways of saying the same thing, whether it's artisanal or boutique. It's always going to be a term of marketing. But I do think it is important for consumers to pay real attention to what is going on in the craft world. You know, we're definitely in the golden age of craft. When I started researching and writing about this field 10, 12 years ago, there were maybe 3 to 4 dozen distillers, small distillers, who had started up in that time. Now, I think we're just up over 1,000, according to the American Craft Spirits Association. And the one economic analysis projects that we'll have 2,000 craft distillers in the next 5 years, all producing. So it's certainly, you know, there's a need for people, I think, to start paying attention to what is going on out there. Everybody's got different approaches and different reasons for doing it. I mean, craft distilling, I think, is it's a remarkable art. If you think about it, you know, distillation started with alchemy 500, 600 years ago, the alchemists making things. And it's still pretty much alchemy. You're taking one object and converting it into something else. You may start with wheat or barley or sugar cane or grapes, and you're converting that into something entirely different and often delicious. I mean, that's alchemy. We're not turning straw into gold, but we're turning straw into bourbon, and that's pretty damn close to it. So a true craft distiller has to be, you know, very conversant in biology. All liquor starts as something that comes out of the ground. They need to know about yeast, which is part of the fungus kingdom. They need to know about chemistry, which underlies the fractional distillation, splitting up one compound into individual elements and capturing them and figuring out what to do with those. It requires a virtual legal degree to find your way through regulations imposed by the TTB and state and local governments. Requires a marketing degree to figure out how liquor distribution works, and more to the point, how to make it work to your benefit. It requires an understanding of political science, because you have to spend a fair amount of time lobbying state and local governing bodies to allow you to do what you do. And it requires an understanding of storytelling, because that's what helps a product break through the clutter. I think it was last year TTB approved 34,000 individual labels for the spirits industry, and that's a lot of noise. Those who can break through can tell a good story. They also have to tell a story that's accurate, because people are getting more and more called out on telling crap stories, false stories, just getting the marketing out there. So it's a pretty rare bird who can find its way through this morass and come out with a product that's terrific. It has to be as good as what the big manufacturers are doing, but it has to be different. They can't compete on price because the economies of scale, but it can't be too different. You can't come out with a whiskey that tastes like Good and Plenty or something. It's got to be something that stays within the colors, within the lines. I mean, so it's really, it's an amazing field. It's amazing art that these people, these distillers are coming into it and doing it. So I get really aggravated when I see those that are basically drafting in behind it. There's a lot of demand for craft right now, and we're seeing a lot of so-called craft distillers that I think are sort of getting in behind and finding that they can sell a bottle of vodka for $45 that they really haven't had much to do with it at all. You know, they're just buying it in bulk and rebottling it. That's part of it. And then I think there's also an issue. I see a lot of craft distillers thinking it'd be cool to get into it, but they're not putting in the time to figure out what it is. They dismiss the big guys, you know, so yeah, well, we're small, so we must be good. But they're overlooking the fact that the big guys been doing it for 150 years and they're producing some pretty damn good stuff. And you've got to compete with that. It's not enough just to be small or different. It's got to be good and different. So I get aggravated when I see somebody that's got the small craft liquor for 50 bucks. You realize they've skipped all of the classes and all these different subjects except for marketing. It's probably, you know, it looks like they only went to marketing about half the days. And I get aggravated when a distiller tries to tell me something like, oh, this is a small barrel whiskey. It's very grain forward. And I want to say, no, it's not. All I smell is damp silage. I think, like, you're giving me a lump of dough and you're telling me it's a biscuit. And it's just, like, I seem to get a fair amount of that, and I think that needs to be called, those need to be called out on. There's no, you know, some might say there's no harm, no foul. The only ones who are buying this might be, you know, easily diluted hipsters who will pay, you know, anything for anything that's local, or if it has Brooklyn on it. I think my favorite one, I've seen a lot of ones that I put in the category of somewhat sketchy craft, but my favorite one was the group out of Brooklyn. It was importing neutral grain spirits from the Midwest, adding Brooklyn tap water to it, and then it was labeled as handcrafted in Brooklyn, things like that, and selling it for a nice premium. Now, like I said, some people might think, well, there's no harm, no foul. The people who are stupid enough to buy this stuff probably deserve it. But my worry is, and I think we'll talk a little bit about today, is that the crafty distillers versus the craft distillers, the ones who are callow and greedy, dishonest, lazy, they're taking the dollars away from those who are practicing true craft. We're putting the money and the time and the effort into getting it done right. That's just not a sustainable strategy, I don't think, if we want to see the craft distilling world continue to expand and grow and experiment. And I know I want to see that happen. And I fear that with some of the secondary stuff, the consumers are going to try it, people new to the market, and say, we'll spend $45 for this bottle of whiskey, this bottle of vodka, and realize it's not that good. They sort of turn off, I think, to the whole craft world, and I think there needs to be a little bit more. The market, you know, the market tends to sift these out, but I'm afraid that with all this imperfect information out there about what craft is, that that's not really going to happen very efficiently. So we're hoping with these set of questions, sort of some tools for people to start sifting through what is deserving of support and what should probably be left to die a slow and unfortunate death, or fortunate in this case. So that's what we're here to do, educate, provide some tools. This is my 11 tales of the cocktails I mentioned, and one of the things I've learned here is that the people in these rooms really serve as ambassadors to go back out into the world. So we're hoping you take some of these questions and help educate other people, whether it's bartenders or liquor reps or fellow consumers, about, you know, what you should be paying attention to in the craft world. So we'll get into that at this point. Right now, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to talk for 5 minutes about what they do and why they do it and what they define as craft. Also, I asked each of them to send me one photograph from their operations that for them defines that craft. So why don't we start with
yeah. All right. My name is Christian Krogstad. I started House Spirits Distillery in 2002. I got into production in 2004. So we've been at it for, 12 years. Our flagship product, I guess you would call it, is the Aviation Gin, which is just celebrating its 10th anniversary. You have a sample of that labeled House Spirits here in the bottom right-hand quadrant of your sample of your tasting mat. Feel free to try that anytime you want. If you have questions about that, either now or later, please ask. But I'm sure a lot of you have already tried it, familiar with it. It's been out, like I said, now 10 years. It is a American dry style, or some call it Western dry. There's a lot of different labels that we were involved in helping to sort of promote or to articulate that style. But my experience in sort of craft or artisanal production goes back, years before that. I think as a lot of people do, I started as a home brewer in 1988. Moved to Portland in 1991 to become a professional brewer. Worked in brewing, small-scale brewing, craft brewing, whatever you want to call it, for about 10 years after that. Managed a winery for a couple years before I started the distillery. So I guess I've got about 25 years in beverage alcohol. And so in that time, I've had a lot of different experiences in craft and small-scale production, in helping to promote and to further the cause of craft. And it's definitely been a crusade of mine. But more recently, I think I've come to the conclusion that it's more important for you all to decide for yourselves what craft is. It's our job, I think, to make what we believe is craft, and to be transparent and open and honest about what we do. And every one of you is going to have your own sort of bar that you set for what is craft. Maggie and I were on a panel 2 years ago when the American Craft Spirits Association started, and there was a lot of, we were on the ethics panel. We were tasked with coming up with a code of ethics.
So easy.
For this new organization, and there was a lot of pressure, a lot of interest. A lot of people wanted to, as Wayne mentioned, a lot of people wanted this process to conclude with a definition of craft. So, who are the craft distillers who could be members of the American Craft Spirits Association?
We get secret pins, tapes, it's awesome.
And to have some standards of size or production methods or whatever. And I'm really happy that what we ended up with was a very simple and very straightforward and easy to understand and easy to enforce standard of just honesty. So that the ethics statement of the American Craft Spirits Association reads something like, don't lie, basically. And if you do that, you're good. And then that's why, I said it's up to you to decide then for yourselves what's craft. And I think it's the responsibility of the media to to be skeptical and to actually be the ones who are skeptical of the marketing messages and who are actually visiting the distilleries. And you all can't visit every distillery that is supplying products to you. You rely on the people who are doing this every day, and I think that we need to expect that from the media, that they're telling us whether the marketing message is true or not.
Briefly, the photo.
Oh, well, yes, so the photo. Oh, is my time up? Wayne asked for a picture that represented to me or to each of us what is craft about what we do. And instead of sending pictures of ash tuns or fermenters or stills or whatever, I sent this picture in because so what the picture is in our tasting room we have a display of basically our library of first bottle of each run of a number of a lot of different products that we've made over the years. So going back to our opening, and can't really see too well, but I'll describe what's on there. There are anywhere from, there is a bottle of Volstead vodka, where we purchased neutral grain spirit from MGP Products, which I think they make fantastic neutral grain spirit. We filter it in charcoal. We filter it in a specific way for a specific effect that we want. I think it's a lovely, delicious vodka. And then we bottle it. So in that case, we're crafting the vodka.
He was honest.
We have a Palinka on the other end of the spectrum, where we went out and picked about 1.5 tons of Brooks plums. We pitted them ourselves. We macerated them and fermented them and distilled it and bottled it. So we've got that. We've got a variety of whiskeys where we both mashed and fermented and distilled ourselves, and also some from earlier on where we had a microbrewery do the mash, and we trucked over the wash and fermented it at our place and distilled it. So I would contend each of these products is craft, but it's up to you to decide how interested you are in what we did and how interesting it is or how good it is as a product. So there you go. That's my rant.
Maggie.
Yep. Hey guys. On the tasting mat in front of you, top left corner, is the Privateer rum. This is our Queen Share rum. Queen Share was a very traditional style of rum from the Caribbean. It essentially went extinct as a dead style of rum, and we began distilling it about 4.5 years ago. And that could be a whole seminar in and of itself, what Queen Share rum is. But this is a single cask strength, 114 proof. It's this red bottle up here, and it's supposed to have pretty rich texture, and we're really going for sort of a layered complexity. It's about 3.5 years old. And one of the most exciting things about this product is part of the vision of Privateer was the owner, Andrew Cabot, was long and old ties to the rum community in Boston. When he found out his family made rum, went to the Caribbean and started tasting with distillers, and distillers would always have in their drawer like this secret little bottle of a cask. It was unfiltered and unsweetened and uncolored, and it would just be magical and beautiful. This is what I love. And then he was looking at the finished product and saying, and they're kind of different. And so when we bottle this, this comes directly from the cask. We have a racking cane that goes into the barrel and literally pulls it from the barrel to the bottling line. No filtering, no proofing, nothing. So what you taste is exactly what the distiller tastes. So if you guys will raise your cups to the caps real quick. Thank you guys. Long hours, early mornings, especially wearing our leaf cap. Cheers.
And your photo?
Yes. So I love this photo. It's very subtle. It's just barrels, whatever, right? But if you'll notice, the bum is really damaged. And that is a classic sign of the Privateer cellar. We are constantly tasting and evaluating casks. The life of our casks is really near and dear to us, and we're very serious about our old stock. As a younger distillery, we're about 5 years old. It's really important to us to lay down way more rum than we need so it can get older. We're constantly harvesting as soon as the cask is ready. It's never going to get any better. So when you go into our barrel room, you'll see completely destroyed bums there from all of our tasting. And Privateer, you know, my background was originally in whiskey. If you had asked me 12 years ago what I'd be doing, I was studying to make rye whiskey. I was going to make rye whiskey. Dave Pickerel was my professor at Siebel before he started Whistle Pig, so a little bit back there. He released it shortly after. And so for me, that was going to be what was going to happen for me. I had spent some time in Scotland, fell in love with distilling, came back to the US, and 12 years ago, there was not craft distilling schools. There was not much here. So I actually went to wine school and studied wine and fermentation and barrel selection and tasting technique. And ended up getting my diploma from the Wine and Spirits Education Trust in London. And I'm also studying at the Masters of Wine right now. And Germain Robon, I come into contact with, being someone who had a background in wine and loved distilling, I thought you better talk to. That's people who distill wine. And I was fortunate enough to be offered a position there, so I jumped the whiskey train over the cognac style train. And then ended up spending some time there and really connecting with Hubert. And Hubert eventually came across Privateer. He met Andrew, he heard his vision, this pure spirit, unadulterated, just straight spirit water oak and thyme. And kind of doing this new yet really old take on rum, and we called it up. Bonjour Maggie, c'est rum distillerie. And moved my whole life to Boston to work with Privateer. So if you had asked me 12 years ago when I first got started, I would have said rum? No, I don't make rum. And now, absolutely in love with it. It's been the most incredible 5 years of my career. So that's what took me there. Christian and I, as he mentioned, ACSA Ethics. I'm also on their board of directors. So it's very interesting. You'll never see Privateer really market ourselves as craft. But we are very active in the craft community, and as he mentioned, it's all about honesty. And I love the title of this because it's 10 questions to ask every craft distiller. It's not distillers telling you what craft is, it's us saying to you guys, hey, when you're buying spirits, you are hit with this wall of craft all day. There's a huge variation in quality, huge variation in style, and what do you guys need to know so you know what it is you're actually paying for? Is that $60 bottle of craft rum really $60 worth? Is it a unique expression you can't see anywhere else that brings a unique style to your cocktails that really makes it something new and exciting for your customer? Or are you sort of being taken in by this marketing that's more marketing than reality? So I'm really excited to talk to you guys and go over what's important to you as buyers. You know, the title craft is relatively meaningless if there's no quality and style, transparency, and honesty behind it. And so I think we're going to give you guys some great tools to kind of go back into the real world and face that wall of marketing that you guys are being hit with.
I would point out too, if anybody was in the rum seminar yesterday morning, somebody got out in the roads and railed on about how much craft a lot of the new small craft distillers were producing when it came to rum. I think this Queen Share is a pretty nice additive for that.
Thank
pretty
you.
amazing stuff.
Yeah.
I think next up we've got Brian at the end, and go ahead.
Yeah, so my name's Brian Prewitt, master distiller for A. Smith Bowman. And at A. Smith Bowman, I am, the title of master distiller really means I'm the head janitor, the head lead maintenance guy, I'm the head tour guide. I get to do everything from raw materials to final product. I got my start very similar to two other panelists here as well. I started in the brewing industry. I got a degree in food science, went into the brewing industry, small craft micro distilleries or breweries. Then I got the whiskey bug. And I've been in the industry for about 20 years, so this was long before small distillers really existed. So I went to work for a very, very large distillery and winery on the West Coast for many, many years. And it was great to really see, just because of the size of the distillery, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not making great product. And having the opportunity to learn under people that have been doing their trade for years, 20, 30, 40 years, to be able to get this kind of insight. Working under them for well over 10 years, and you're still called the new guy. You're the rookie. You're just the new guy in the distillery. Fast forward, I had the opportunity to move to A. Smith Bowman a few years ago, about 3 years ago now, I guess, almost exactly. And I've been crafting whiskeys and bourbons, rums, gin, vodka, spring liqueurs, you name it, I'll try it. It's out there. And this is a wonderful picture of two of my, I call that my playground. So when I bring people into the distillery, I say, well, welcome to my playground. And that's my playground. Those are two of my good friends. That's Mary and George, my two stills that I get to play with all the time, and crafting all the great spirits that we do. So, and I'm going to completely avoid the snake's nest that is the craft spirit question. That is one of those things that there is really what I think is really important is there is no one good definition. I think you should look for the things that are really important to you, the things, the spirits that speak to you, and the products that you like. I think that's what it really comes down to. Now, obviously, there's a lot of stuff out there, and you're going to have to weed through it. But hopefully, panels like this, discussions like what we're having, will help you weed through that.
One of the reasons we wanted it, and like Brian and Smith Bowman, is the ownership issues. We'll circle around to they're owned by Sazerac Corporation, major corporation, but as I gather you don't get much interference. We'll talk about that a little bit.
We will, and I almost forgot when of course, on the bottom left-hand corner, we brought one of our spirits. This is our John J. Bowman, which is a single barrel bourbon. We don't use any wheat in our recipe. It is only corn, rye, and malt. It is 100 proof, and we don't put an age statement on the bottle. It's anywhere from 9 to 12 years old. It averages around 10. So enjoy.
And Scott, Hardware and Trail.
I'm Scott Blackwell from Highwire in Charleston. That's all I have to say. Well, you kind of ruined my intro there. You stepped on me. I had it written down. So, similar to these other guys, I have been in and around the food and beverage business since I was 15. I washed dishes starting out, and kind of worked my way up through the restaurant business. And this is actually business number 6 for me, all food related. My last business would probably be the most, one of the 2 businesses I would say pertinent to what we're doing today. And like Christian, I was home brewing. Probably you did too. We probably did too. I mean, very good. It's our spare bedroom smelled like a brewery with fermentation and everything like that going on. We had a couple of little minor explosions and stuff, and some beer going wrong, things like that. But we looked really hard. We had a bakery before this, and I fell in love with grain and fermentation and sort of the process, similar to beer. What I learned is that homebrew kit you get, it's like 7 easy steps, and you have beer. Well, there's really like about 40 hidden steps there, and there's a lot of variables of how you kind of approach it. We were looking at getting into the beer business, and my wife said, beer scares me. There's a lot of breweries. Why don't we do something too that's a little where we can bring something new to the game? There's a lot of guys like us already doing breweries. This was a little over 4 years ago. We flew out to Portland, Oregon, met this guy down at the end here, went to his original distillery, and saw what. And it inspired me. He looked at me and he said, "You don't have a big enough gut and a beard. You don't need to be in the beer business. You need to see your wife." Just joking for all you know. Anyway, I just, I came into it very cynically, thinking, what can we bring to spirits? And I grew up in South Carolina where it was mini bottles, and the selection of what we had there was pretty bad. And liquor stores were like, crack houses. They were sort of dark, big, dirty places where people hung out front bumming cigarettes and drinking pints, that kind of thing. So it wasn't a real sexy business like it is in Portland and places like that where they have these beautiful stores. It's changing in South Carolina. We have some beautiful stores now, and they really are, up in the game. We also have gotten rid of the mini bottle thing behind the bars. But I just looked at booze as something in the bottle, that you drank, and tequila, for instance, was something that you definitely drank to get drunk. It was not something you drank to enjoy like it is today. So I remember a few years ago, people said, "You want a shot of tequila?" And I'm like, "Hell no, I don't want to eat tequila. I don't want to get drunk." So it's sort of that type of thinking. And I'd never made spirits. I made beer, and we hired Dave Pickerell. He came in. Friends of ours up in Asheville. We went up there and worked with him originally at Asheville Distilling. And I remember seeing the the distillate come off, and I was like, oh wow, it's sweet, it's complex, it's got interesting flavors. So my thinking started to turn. It wasn't like, oh, this is, big brand out of a bottle type flavor that I've ever had, This is a new flavor. That, I guess it was that spring, a guy named John T. Edge, who runs the Southern Foodways Alliance, and I were walking along at a festival, and he said, Scott, what about working with sorghum? What about that? Have you ever thought about doing something with sorghum? And I was like, well, I used it in the bakery for my gluten-free baked goods. I don't know what that would taste like, but I'll get some sorghum. We got some sorghum in and fermented it. It was a crazy fermentation where we had, all this fruit esters and everything, and then we came off the still, and I was like, wow, this is very unique. It was like the light bulb went off of kind of this agriculture matters, and what you're drinking, what is in the bottle is agriculture. And what sort of led us to this path today, and what I think our place is in this industry, is getting closer to the agriculture. I started thinking about tomatoes. I have a culinary background there again, thinking about flavors. When I grew up, tomatoes were just round, fibrous, things that I didn't really like. And I didn't think I liked tomatoes until I was older and had, what I would call the Cherokee purples and all that heirloom tomatoes you see today. And I thought, well, corn has got to be the same way. So I started looking at corns, different styles of corns. A friend of mine owns a company called Anson Mills, and I went and met with him at Clemson at the extension, and I said, Glenn, what kind of corn would you use if you were making whiskey? And he pointed to the corn that's in the picture there. That's called Jimmy Red, and said, this is the corn. This is a bootlegger's corn way back. It got down to 2 cobs and almost went extinct. And I have seed, and we should plant some, and you should make some whiskey with it. And so there again, I'm like, it's pretty, it's cool looking. The story's there, but is the flavor there? We grew it. I was out there every week. I watched them put the seeds in the ground all the way through harvest, where we actually had to hand harvest because we couldn't get a combine in and it was raining so much. So we touched that corn all the way through. So by the time we got to fermentation, I was like, wow, okay, I'm on pins and needles and excited. And we put it in the fermenter, and there was an oil cap on it that was probably 2 inches thick. I've never seen or smelled anything like this with other corns we've been using. And when we were on the grain, so everything goes over, grain and all, oil and all, into the still, and it's coming off the still, and it tastes like marzipan and cherry. It doesn't taste like corn. And I'm like, okay, agriculture, this matters. This is our path. We experimented we do a rum agricole every year. We take fresh cane juice. We just finished up this last week a watermelon brandy, so we take heirloom watermelons. So my whole quest has been to get back to that plant and get into sort of pushing that envelope. This is something that we can do. That the big boys can do whatever they want to do, but they're not going to go out and do these things. Really, especially as fast and furious, and kind of like Chris John says. We have every bottle, everything we've made in the house, so the history's there. Some good, some bad, some ugly, but we have it, and it's been, I call it this last 3 years, about 60% R&D and about 40% actually doing something, correctly. We continue to, there again, to sort of say that we are making spirits with a sense of place. So our spirits, I think, reflect the South where we are, different from, say, Boston or Oregon. And that's the reason that it's cool to have all these distilleries coming out. We're in a real renaissance now. And I think, it's to be hopeful about this. I think it's, you're going to see some exciting things that, we're going to push the big boys to get up off their rear ends and quit talking about what kind of water they use and how old something is. It's like, that's not everything. There's a lot more to what's in that bottle. So.
Okay, that makes a good transition to getting into the into some of the questions. Now we'll go through each of the 10 questions, but about 4 minutes on each to talk about it.
Sorghum.
Oh, sorry.
Sorghum.
Yeah,
sorry. Yes. Top right. That's the sorghum, yeah. So it's got that banana bread nose. Yeah. So it's an alt whiskey. So yeah.
Yeah. Sorghum's an interesting thing. There's also sorghum rum. There's sorghum spirit. It's a little contentious right now, but that'll sort itself out. We're just starting the questions out at the end. We have a card with all 10 questions on it, so don't feel the need that you need to jot them down. If that was your inclination, we'll pass those out before you go. And like I said, we'll spend about 4 minutes on each question, then open up for questions from you towards the end. Again, as one of the panelists already mentioned, each of you will weight each of these questions differently. For some of you, size may not matter. Locally sourced ingredients may matter more. For each of these questions, some will be more important for you than others. So keep that in mind as we start going through. We'll start off with a fairly basic and simple one, at least outwardly. I think it becomes less simple the more you dig into it. But how many bottles do you produce each year? That's something that's continually being discussed. The craft brewing industry started out capping how many barrels a year the members make. And just basically every year they just keep upping the number so it grows as the industry grows, which sort of takes some of the charge out of it. ADI caps it at about 50,000 cases a year. ACSA, much more aggressive, about 350,000 cases a year. I talked to Paul Letko, the president, the other day, saying like, well, that's pretty high. He said, well, we didn't want to fall into the trap of the beer people of having to, once people get successful, either coming to the point where you either have to kick the members out or increase the size. So they just went high. I said, how many are producing near 350? He said, none. I said, well, how many are producing like around 50,000 a year? He said, none. So they're sort of looking to the future. But I think that's one of the things that people, consumers generally think about when they think about craft. They think about size. How big is your operation? If it's a huge operation, probably not craft. That's where I think it gets complicated, because I think of all the industries, the spirits industry is one where I think I have seen personally some pretty large producers who I think are doing craft. It seems to scale up in the spirit world. So I'd like to discuss that a little bit. Maybe Christian, you want to start on this one? Talk a little bit about this?
Sure.
And then anyone else can jump in. I got the alarm set.
All right. Well, I'll answer the question and then answer it in several different ways. So the simplest answer is we bottle about 300,000 bottles a year. We produce about 600,000 bottle equivalents because we're putting down a lot of whiskey. So so there's a difference between what you produce and what you bottle. There's also a difference between what you produce for yourself and what you might do contract production for other people. So we're currently not really doing any contract production. We have in the past. We've helped launch several distilleries that are now off in their own spaces where we did the contract production for them. And again, arguably, they were craft distillers because they created a recipe and they caused us to produce that for them. So getting back to the question of what is craft.
Steer clear.
Yeah. So yeah, that's in a simple answer. We bottle around 300,000 bottles, which is about 25,000 9-liter cases. But we're producing about double that because we just got a new distillery online, and we're filling about 1,000 barrels a year of whiskey.
Do any of you think it makes sense to sort of create a new category of micro distillery, which is entirely based on size but doesn't really imply anything about craft?
I don't know. I'm not super into all the titles, and it's like playing like an RPG and you can level up, you know? I'm just like, I'm not super into it. It is what it is. Be honest about what it is, and people can kind of, I mean, there's a lot of talk about what is craft, what isn't. oh, it's all relative. No, it's not. We all know what it is when we see it. I think that's enough myself. But I've been doing it a few more years. We're more established. I think you can tend to see a general tone change as distilleries start and as they mature towards the issue of craft. And I'm sort of in that middle period where I feel a lot more confident. You know, not a lot of people know what my brand is, and that's fine, but the people who do know, they get it. They know what's up. And I don't feel like I have to announce it to the world, but in my earlier days when I was a little less secure and a little more nervous and a little more, this is what I do, don't point at me and pretend you do what I do, I think those days are important to really differentiate yourself. But no, the answer is no, I don't think we do. You guys?
Well, I would echo that. I mean, really, I have a Southern folk art collection. I started collecting back in the 80s, and the term folk art is exactly like craft. In the museum world, they love to say, well, is it outsider? Is it naive? Is it self-taught? Now there's the word vernacular art. And I just say, when people say, oh, what kind of art do you have? I say folk art, because that's what I know what I have, and and look at it. That's what we have, So, you call it whatever the hell you want, but that's what we call it. And it just is craft to me. People get it when you say I'm a craft distillery. They understand what that means. Micros, I don't know. It sounds like it's like real small.
Yeah.
And then we are small, but it's like maybe we're in our garage with a little.
Well, and I think it's a good point. I mean, I think what happens, for us, we get that question all the time. How much do you produce? How big are you? And I like to tell people, I've got 12 people at the distillery, and there's 4 of us in production, and I'm one of those 4 people. So I have 2 people on the line, hand bottling, taking the bottles out of the box, putting them through a rinser, filling them by hand, corking them by hand, labeling them by hand, and putting them in a case. We're lucky if we can get 120 cases done in a day. And that's a 6-pack case. That's not a 12 or a 24-pack case. But we're lucky if we can do that. Now, if we could get twice as much done in a day, would I love it? Heck yeah, I would love it, because that's a lot less work for me.
Yeah.
But
I think that, sorry.
Time's up.
I think the question is important for you guys as far as what to ask a craft distiller, in that, is this a unique expression? Am I paying for something that is sort of really large format, and sometimes that character can be blended away when you're trying to go for really large volumes, or is this something super special and unique? I think, I've gotten in some amazing discussions where I say Buffalo Trace is a craft distiller, and you have their regular bourbon, and it's value priced because it's a large volume, and then their specialty stuff is higher priced because it's smaller volume. So I think that a lot of times that question can come into hand when you're trying to judge, what is this spirit category, how does it work on my bar, and what am I paying for? I think that's why the how big are you question is important.
We're going to move on to the next question, but you heard it here first. Scott Blackwell has proposed a new category of vernacular whiskey.
What about vernacular rum?
Yeah. Question 2. Do you make some or all of your alcohol through fermentation? I think the resident curmudgeon on the panel, Christian Krogstad, pointed out in an email yesterday that none of us make alcohol, the yeast makes alcohol. Shut up. But whether or not that production occurs at the distillery or not, I think that's a worthy question to ask to find out what's going on there. Maggie, would you like to address this?
We take a lot of pride on making every single drop of alcohol from scratch. We take a very simple and relatively affordable ingredient, sugar. We add value to it, we tend to it, we create something completely new with it that will not taste like it is from anywhere else. And for us, that means what you get in bottle, what you guys just tasted, is a singular expression. And that's the expression of North Shore, maritime climate, New England rum. And that's really exciting for us. And creating that value is really important to us. We take the simple ingredient, we create a value-added product, and that creates local wealth. Then we sell that to our local bartenders, Freddie Arm right here. He takes that, he makes an incredible drink with it, he turns it into something completely new that he gives his guests, that's a singular expression of his hand, and that creates local wealth for him. And for us, that's really important. If I were just purchasing and packaging, I wouldn't be creating any value. What value would I be adding, and what local wealth would I be creating? And for me, as a former buyer and a former barback, when I was 17, that's the important question is this a really large format, relatively large, bulk manufacturer that is under a label that is $50 when the exact same product potentially from the same warehouse is next to it for $20? Are you being taken as a bartender? Are you then unfortunately, subconsciously or unknowingly taking your customer? And so for us, it's really important to do things from scratch. That's our model. We're proud of what we do. It's not passing judgment on what anyone else does. There are different products with different goals for different price points. It's different tools for you guys, and that's fantastic. When I go out to drink, I rarely drink my own stuff. I do sometimes when I'm really excited, but I like to see what's out there and see what's going on, and not everyone's trying to make what I'm making. That's what I'm making, and that's why my bottle costs what it does. We're really lucky that we work really hard to keep it affordable. It's important to me as someone who got started at such a young age, when I was super broke, that people be able to buy our rum and be able to enjoy it. So we try to keep it at a really super reasonable price. People can use it in the well, people can use it in drinks, the silver and our amber rum, and then we have our more cool specialty stuff when we really want to geek out. But what are you paying for? Where did it come from? We have 3 employees full-time on our production. You buy our shoes and our tires and our oil changes, and it's important. So that's where the money goes, to building real jobs, real local manufacturing, and real local sort of growth. So that's why it's important to us to make it from scratch.
Scott, you want to join in on?
Yeah, well, for me, we source GNS for our gin that we make. We felt like when we were starting that making GNS was, it's a tall order, and our still is really built more for whiskey than for gin or for vodka, and so we wanted we didn't want to make a white whiskey to pay the bills in the meantime, and then also I love gin, so we sort of went about that. But in parallel, we pushed for, like I say, these other things that we make completely from, sort of rooter to tutor, from scratch. The watermelon, the rum agricole, the whiskeys, and to be perfectly honest, it takes every bit of energy that we have to make whiskey. It is hard to make whiskey, to make good whiskey, and we're not there yet. We're not to that point. And I don't know that you ever get to that point where everything's perfect. So.
I think one of the points to make on the fermentation is that there's also a gray area here. A lot of places they may not ferment, but they're maybe making something like gin or liqueur. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there's also that do both. As Christian said at the outset, it was also buying as well as fermenting. And I think Brian down at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear the alarm
Never
going
mind.
off, right? I'm
Yeah.
off the hook, right?
Yeah. Brian, I know, imports some of the distillate in from the parent company, and then
absolutely.
advances that, but also you do fermentation of some of your own.
Absolutely, we do both. So we have we're fortunate in the fact that I do have a great sister company, Buffalo Trace, that will do the fermentations and recipe to my specifications, to our specifications, as opposed to just buying it as a commodity off the market. So I can have those things done, and then I bring in the raw distillate and redistill to my specifications on site for our bourbons and for our whiskeys, and then age on site and process. But we also we bring in Caribbean rum, because to be called a true Caribbean rum has to be made in the Caribbean. And there's certain parts of that Caribbean rum that I think are really interesting. We get a portion of that pot stilled rum is distilled in a 250-year-old wooden pot still. I don't have a 250-year-old wooden pot still. I think that's pretty cool. And the fact is that we tell people about that. We let them know, hey, we're bringing this in. We don't make this. It is our blended recipe that is made for us, and we think it's exceptional. We think it's a great product, and that's what we want to convey to our consumers. People that buy it, they're like, hey, we're going to be very upfront and honest. We make a lot of spirits. We have a lot of experimentations. I crushed 40,000 pounds of apples in January, which made all of 2,000 gallons of the juice, which turned into 3 barrels of apple brandy. So yeah, doing crazy things, trying different grains, different fruits, different, you name it, we'll try it. So we do both.
Okay. Moving on to the third question. How many stills do you operate, and what size are they? I think probably another question within there is what type of stills. That takes you down a whole other path that can get a little thorny. As if you were at the rum seminar yesterday, you discovered the pot versus column. But I think knowing about the stills that the distillery is operating is one of those key elements to start trying to figure out what they're up to, what their intentions are, what their approach is. Any of you care to start off on this one?
I'll dive in, of course. We have 2 stills at our facility. We double distill everything. So we have a first distillation, a priming still. It helps prime the spirit. And then we have the spirit still, which is for the second distillation. Our first distillation is 1,000 gallons. It's a Vendome sort of whiskey style pot still. And then our second still is from Carl in Germany. It's sort of like an eau de vie style still, and it can be either run as a pot, so we can do double pot distillation, or it also has an optional column with 8 plates, and we can choose what plates to run. And each plate kind of creates a level of purification, so that the more plates that are on, the more pure the spirit, but less flavorful, and the less plates, the less pure, but more flavorful. And so for us, people will come into our distillery and say, you know, your still is really huge. And I walk in and I'm like, this still is tiny. And it's because they're going to a lot of distilleries that bulk purchase most of what they do. So what they distill is tiny, and I could wrap my arms around it, you know, and what we do is distill every drop. So that kind of creates like a different mood in people's minds. Our still also talking about the different styles of stills. One of the most exciting things for me about rum that I never experienced in whiskey or cognac is we'll run the still different ways to distill to different proofs, so different levels of intensity of flavor. We'll taste that batch and match it to a barrel, so if it's really powerful, a new barrel. If it's really subtle, a used barrel. If it's really floral and we really want it to get that oxidative character without a lot of wood, we'll go into maybe a 3rd or a 4th use cask. And then we let those casks age so that when we marry them together, you get this huge complexity of flavor. Whereas
Maggie, we're going to do barrels further down the list.
I'll stop barrels.
Don't be stepping on your own lines.
Pot, column, and 1,000 gallons, and then our second still is 200 gallons.
Does size matter? If anyone want to join in on when it comes to stills, is that something that should be part of craft? Or?
I don't know that size necessarily matters unless you're really talking about the differences that you can get versus small stills versus large stills. I think I've seen some really wonderful spirits come off 10-foot diameter column stills. You know, so those are obviously as big as you could get. But for us, we have the same size. You know, obviously we name our stills. We're just kind of weird that way. We have a 25-year-old Vendome 2,000-gallon copper pot still. Unique design, designed by the owners of the distillery years ago. I don't think you'll see anything like it. And then we also have a hybrid still as well. So we have a 500-gallon hybrid still. We are a little bit larger column because we want the ability to go up to a higher proof. We have a 20-plate bubble cap, and plus a 4-plate on top of the still. So we have a combination of about 24 plates that we can go. First time we fired George up, he was hitting 193 proof and just humming, and he loved it, and it was great. And we also, with that still, we have the ability to, with a bubble cap, we have the ability to pull off of any plate. So we can run rums, or we can run whiskeys, or eau de vies, and pull fusel oils, and pull esters, and just basically play with all those different flavors that can be found on a still. And I think each still has their own purpose. And you know, we love the whiskey that comes off our large still, and we're still finding out what kind of great things can come off our smaller still.
I guess I wanted to just point out a couple things about still size. We operate four stills. The largest is a 3,000-gallon Vendome beer still. We have a 700-gallon spirit still, 400-gallon gin still, and then a 2-liter lab still. And the reason, I think, one reason that size can matter is, you know, on the little lab still, the smaller you get, the harder it is to get accurate cuts, or to get, you know, the cuts you want, or meaningful cuts. And the larger stills allow us, you know, there's more volume coming off, so you have a little better chance of, you know, making cuts that, you know, that you want.
Yeah. Can I say something real quick?
I'm sorry.
So, like Todd Leopold, who is generally unequivocally craft, he does not like getting bigger stills. He'll buy repeat clone stills, and his philosophy is that the smaller batch creates a subtle nuance, and then those smaller batches with more differentiated nuance come together for more complexity. So some people will size up in volume, and some people will size up in clone.
I think probably the most important answer you might get to this is no stills. We don't have stills, and then you want to pursue that question about, well, what is it that you're actually doing? So there are quite a few, people that claim to be distillers who are just buying and filtering and things like that. So that's a key one. But that, I think, segues into the fourth question: do you buy any neutral grain spirits, and if so, what do you use them for? I think this people tend to think this is. Those coming from the outside think, well, if you're just buying neutral grain spirits, you're not really doing anything. But that's not necessarily true. Then you get to the point where you have to ask, well, what is it that you're making? Gin, for instance, is quite typical that people start with neutral grain spirits. There's some who will argue that, as Maggie has, that economically it makes more sense to even make your own neutral grain spirit. You're contributing more to your community. But from the side of craft, of actually doing something, differentiating your product, starting with neutral grain spirit is fairly common when making gin, also with making liqueurs. So if somebody doesn't actually have a still and they're buying neutral grain spirits, doesn't necessarily mean they're fakers, but you have to ask a few more questions. If all they're producing is vodka, then you have to go, what's going on here? Are you filtering it through diamonds? What are you doing? To make it interesting and different. So, but it's a good place to start with this sort of the question. Maybe Christian, I think
Sure.
you touched on this a little bit earlier, about saying that you started with some of this.
Yeah, about almost half of the ethanol that we, or the proof gallons that we bottle or that we produce, we purchase from, as I said, MGP Products, great company, and we set about 10 years ago when creating Aviation Gin to make a dry gin. And dry gin is about the botanicals. It's a lighter spirit. Essentially starts with neutral spirit. We weren't really interested in making neutral spirit. Neutral spirit, by its very nature, is neutral. It's ethanol. It's more, neutral spirit production is chemical engineering. It's not craft or art. I don't feel like. I think I've been on record as saying in vodka the craft is in the marketing. So. The goal is to make ethanol. The goal in neutral spirit production is to make ethanol, and ethanol is a great, blank canvas for making dry gin. So we take the ethanol, we macerate botanicals, we redistill to capture the essential oils of those botanicals. It's essentially, dry gin is very much, a very dilute perfume. It's delicious. It's fantastic in cocktails. It is more importantly, it's sort of what people expect when they buy a gin. And so for the consumer market, I think you'll find that consumer and bartender interest tends towards dry gins rather than Genevers. I think Genevers are great if you want to produce a grain spirit at 180 proof and make a gin from that. It's really a Genever, and that's great. It's just a different thing. So.
Okay.
That answer your question?
I think that answered the question. Why don't we move on? We've got about a half hour left. I want to make sure I get through all the questions, and we can circle back around and talk about any of these that folks are interested in. Number 5, do you buy and rebottle bulk spirits, and if so, do you have any say in the recipe or other product specification? It's become fairly common, especially those starting out who will they don't have a distillery, but they do have a label. They do have a bottling area. They're getting their own things up and going, and they're not making it themselves, but they're buying it. The question is, are you buying it basically off the shelf, or are you working with a producer and trying a bunch of different samples, saying, well, can we tweak the mash bill this way? Can we try to do the rum, different proof, and come up with something that you want? I think that's what lays behind this question, trying to find out, is the person selling it have any say in how the actual product comes out, whether or not they're producing it on their own? Anybody want to jump in on this one?
I don't buy or rebottle bulk spirits.
Well, Maggie's
Don't talk
voice.
to me.
Would you say that that's not craft?
I think it's different than what I do, but it's hard to ask me that because I don't like the whole craft thing. Like, it's different than what I do, and I think that should show in the price. We do distill a neutral cane spirit for our gin from scratch, and I think it's a joy, and I like it. And so we don't purchase our neutral. And it's just different than what I do. And I don't appreciate when people point at what I do and say they do what I do. Because if they want to do what I do, they can come clean some tanks. That would be amazing. And so I think that should show up for you guys as the buyers. If you guys are out there purchasing a product that's made from scratch by, your local community or American made or, here in the States, and with a good team behind them that you're, really contributing to this value-added idea, fantastic. But when you guys are told it's something else and it's not, I think that's a disservice to you guys. And then in turn, you guys will get burnt out on craft and then say, craft doesn't mean good, I don't care, whatever, and then that damages me. So again, it just comes back to the transparency thing.
Yeah, I agree, Maggie. I mean, we do purchase bulk spirits, so we buy, like I was talking about earlier, we purchase a rum. It is our recipe of rum, so in other words, we worked with the distiller to come up with the blend, to come up how we wanted to do it. We wanted the ability to say a Caribbean rum. So yeah, we bring that in. I think what's important is, I think, the honesty and the clarity of this is what we're doing, and this is why this product is special, because this is how we're doing it. And being open and honest about it, and not trying to hide like, oh yeah, we made this. This is the best stuff ever, and then you find out, oh well, it was made by a chemical engineer in some corner of the Midwest. Not saying they're not great, but if you're open and honest about it, then that's a completely different story.
And I just wanted to repeat something that I started to I was talking about on that first question, is just because you don't have a distillery doesn't mean you're not a craftsman, a beverage craftsman. There are lots of examples where people have gone to other, you don't have the capital or the time to start your own distillery. There's lots of examples of people who've gone to an existing distillery and essentially rented space. I mean, there's a whole continuum or a whole spectrum of contract production. You can just buy a product off the shelf, or you can actually be in the distillery helping to make it and creating the recipes. And so just because you don't have a distillery doesn't mean you're not crafting a great product.
I think one of the things to point out too is that ADI, I believe, has created a new category. There's craft distiller, there's now craft blenders. And I think they're starting to try to put these on the label so that there are sort of two categories here that you can look for. And I think this all comes down to really transparency, which is going to be a constant theme. Put on the bottle label what you're doing, how you're doing it, what you're adding to it, that kind of thing. And I think that, for the consumer, makes a huge difference. Question 6. Do you have any products in limited release or that use experimental ingredients or techniques? For me, this is the one I weight most heavily when I visit distilleries. You could be a small distiller and they're just cranking out a vodka, they're cranking out a gin, but they're not playing around. And to me, it tends to be a signal that shows that somebody's. I like obsessives. I like people who are just curious and they want to try things, and they wake up every morning thinking, what if I try this? And then they go ahead and do it. To me, that shows, as not always the case. Sometimes it's just clever marketing, but a lot of times I think it shows that there's some real thought of how things are happening, and curiosity coming out in a bottle, which I think is the thing that really makes craft different from the larger ones. So at a event a few years ago with Dave Pickrell was talking about the future of whiskey, and he said he does consulting with some of the bigger companies. They're not going to try anything new unless they can be reasonably sure it's going to sell 100,000 cases in a year. It just doesn't make sense to gear up for it with marketing, bottling, all that. Then he asked, there was a room of craft distillers, he said, how many of you would produce a liquor if you think it would sell 1,000 cases in a year? Like everybody's hand went up. So it shows you really where all the ingenuity and interest is. So for me, this is one of the first things I asked when I come into a distillery. Was at Dad's Hat in Pennsylvania a few months ago, and they just pulled out a bottle. I said, we bought this load of rye from down in southern Pennsylvania. It was the spiciest thing we had. Everyone thought we were infusing jalapenos in it. And so they just put a sombrero sticker on it, and they had it set aside as a limited their sombrero blend. I think they just had, I don't know, 50 bottles of it or something. But it was tasty and interesting, and I like that about it. So anybody want to join in on this?
Absolutely, I'll take that one. I mean, we release about 3 times a year a limited edition whiskey, and we've done everything from 100% rye to high wheat to high rye to I got a crazy hair, decided to do a coffee barrel finish, which I worked with a local coffee roaster. He aged his coffee in a barrel, and then I beat the barrels until there was absolutely no coffee beans left, and then threw a bourbon back in there and finished it on that barrel. You name it, we'll try it. We were talking about earlier, we do apples. I've got, I don't know how many different whiskey recipes that we're working on. In fact, I think I did 2 different gin recipes and a whiskey recipe just on Monday and Tuesday of this week, trying different stuff. I mean, and that's part of what I do. I just get up there and I think about what I want to try. I'm working with local growers, so hey, Bloody Butcher, I'd love to try that corn. How about growing a couple acres? Let's see what we can do. Local rye, all right, let's try it. And I think that's really important to get it out there and really try these new products, to really push the limits of what spirits can be.
Okay. We could talk about this for a while, but we're going to move on because we've only got about 15 minutes left. I want to make sure we have some time for questions. Do you do your own aging? What size barrels do you use? Are they new or used? And how often do you sample the content of your barrels?
Yes.
Yes, how often?
It's a tough job. Somebody's got to do it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maggie, you want to speak a minute or two on that?
I'll be brief. Yes, we do all our own aging. We age in full-size casks. We're on this beautiful salt marsh right on the ocean, on the Atlantic. It's amazing. All of our stuff, all of our aged spirits are minimum 2 years aged. There's so much happening in barrels, so much that we still don't even understand the science of. We encourage evaporation. I guess we don't actively encourage it, but we celebrate it. A lot of North American distillers can get really freaked out by it, but when you travel through Europe, they'll have wet and dry cellars that encourage different types of evaporation to create different situations within the barrel that change the flavor and complexity and give us what we love about extended age barrel spirits. So we celebrate our hot, humid summers and our cold, dry winters. And the seasonal change. For our amber rum, any bottle you ever get, you can look at the batch number on the back, go to our website, it tells you every single cask it came from and the tasting note from each cask. When we do that selection, we actually marry those barrels together in tank, proof them down a little, and then recask them all into neutral casks to marry in cask. I basically live in the barrel room, and when Wayne asked us to put a photo up, I almost snuck in a photo of Buffalo Trace, because when I was there, the fermentation room was pretty quiet and the still room was pretty quiet, but when you went to the rack house, there were all these guys with these wire trays with their samples, tasting all the casks and really playing around with everything. And I almost snuck that in to be like, so is this
Just
a craft distiller?
Yeah.
And so for us, the barrel aging is really important. It is one of the longest skills to learn, and I feel like craft distilling in general is a multi-generational experience. And craft distilling is really in its infancy, and I think there's a lot of education and a lot of learning going on in the barrel selection, but I still think that's something that, when I'm out tasting a lot of younger stuff or newer distillers, I can get some greenness and some stuff, because barrel selection it's a whole other thing, and I'm very grateful to have the experience for working for a cognac family, because
we could
barrel
do
selection, barrel tasting.
I would like to weigh in just real quick. I'll keep it briefer than that. And say we started off with Dave Pickerell and we bought 15-gallon barrels from Barrel Mill. And then we got stuck in this thing called the barrel shortage, perfect storm that was going on with the wood industry. And I could not, and then I realized I was kind of going down a path I didn't want to go down. and could not get larger format barrels. We ended up buying barrels from a French company and paying about $500 a piece for them to get large format, to get and basically learned through that process that small barrels don't work for us. So we have moved away completely, and Wayne and I have talked extensively.
Yeah, we could do it.
Could talk for hours on that
We
subject.
could do,
but
and I believe we have done a whole seminar on the size of
familiar.
barrels. Yeah, a couple of years ago with Lance Winters choking on the thought of small barrels. Question 8: do you use any additives or sweeteners in your finished spirits? You are under TTB regs allowed to add some things in there. You don't have to label. You can go up to, I think, I don't know if it's across all spirits.
Depends on the category.
Yeah, depending on the category, but for rum, I think 2.5%. You can put glycerin, caramel, some sugar. I know there's people that put vanilla, they put molasses in. They don't have to put it on the label. So I think it's a good question to ask. Anyone want to briefly? I think it's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Anyone briefly want to?
We're really passionate at our distillery. It's about being no additives. It's spirit, water, oaken time. You guys are bartenders. You should decide how sweet the drink is. I shouldn't be giving you something that has the equivalent of 11 sugar cubes in it and then ask you to make a daiquiri out of it. You know, it's already sort of a liqueur. So for us, no sweeteners, no artificial age flavorings, no artificial rum essence. I can literally buy rum flavor and mix it in. I have seen documents that have, you know, fortified wine poured in. I mean, you can add anything you want and not have to really register it.
Yes, Scott showed me the kit when I was visiting him.
Yeah.
Like,
the rum blending kit.
yeah, here,
Right.
what kind of rum do you want? Do you want
Yeah.
like a Demerara rum? Do you want
Yeah.
like a light Puerto Rican rum? And then you just order these flavorings and dump them into your barrels when you're
Yeah.
done to create
So,
them.
no
So it's good to ask
artificial-
about this.
I don't
Yeah.
think Wayne would have asked any of us up here if we added.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there
But
are.
It's a good
those that
question.
do.
It's a good
Yeah.
question. There's artificial mouthfeel agents. There's all sorts of stuff going on there.
It's good to know.
And it's good to know about. And for me, you know, I'm inspired by Alice Waters, the chef. Simple ingredients, set on the plate. You don't need a ton of crap on it if it's already good. Just let it be.
Okay. Question 9: who are the owners, and do they work at the distillery? And I think this is a key one, just to find out how much involvement there is from the people who are there. Although it's also not a slam dunk one. I love going to a place and meeting the folks who own it and know that they flip the switch in the morning to get the distillery going. On the other hand, there's places like A. Smith Bowman where technically the owner is some miles away.
Well, he's a local here.
He's local here, yeah. There's the house up on St. Charles. You haven't been up there. Which locally is referred to the house that Fireball built. It's been under construction for about 5 years. It's still not done. It looks like something from San Simeon, but anyway, the owner is down here. But there's an independence there, so it's not always the same case. Ralph Lorenzo has made the same case at Tuttletown. He founded it. He worked hard. So there are all the early days. Now he's had some success. He can bring some people into work. He travels a little bit more. He may not be there every day, but he makes I think a good argument that it's still craft. They're still doing what he started to do. So it's good to find out who the principals are and what they're up to. But if anyone wants to,
Well,
Brian,
absolutely. I mean, obviously, the owner, the family that owns A. Smith Bowman lives here in town, and they really entrust me and my team to run the distillery for them. They own several businesses, and that's what they do, and they know that the people that they have working for them should be looking out for their best interests. And so, luckily, I'm fortunate in the fact that they stay out of my hair. I don't have a whole lot of hair, so it helps me there. And they pretty much let me run it as if it is my business, and that's the way that I run it, as if I'm the guy that has to take care of everything. So I'm fortunate in that regard. Not everyone has that aspect.
And then the final question, fairly simple. Why should I buy your spirit instead of one made by a larger, more familiar brand? It's so simple that you might stump people on this. They'll each come up with different reasons. I think another one that's sort of one step back from this is similar, which is to ask, why did you get into this? Which is, I think, a question a lot of, particularly the recent craft distillers, we're seeing a lot of what I know Bill Owens at ADI refers to as mid-cap distillers. They're at the outset, someone like Christian got in with credit cards and low 6 figures of investment. Now it's more typical seeing people getting in, spending $2 to $5 million on it. So you want to ask them, are you into this because it's cool, because you want to, you know, be neat to show your hedge fund colleagues that you've got your own whiskey, or is there some sort of, like we talked about earlier, a little bit of an obsession that's driving you to get into it? But the question is, why should I make that? Why should I buy yours rather than a large one? They might make the argument that this is local. We're using this local, you know, heirloom corn. Might be that they talk about local economy, like Maggie does. Everyone will have a different reason, and I think it's a good way to get at to what is important to them. Anybody want to add anything to that?
Well, I think it's curiosity. I mean, I think, you know, if anything, it's fun, you know, to try some new things.
We did it because it's fun.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, none of us here are perfect, and we're not making everything we make is perfect. But I think the spirit is there, and if you really learn and know, and you can kind of build a relationship with your distillers and understand where they're coming from, and understand they're not trying to, you know, rip you off and just charge you extra, or trying to, you know, just put something in a bottle and try to get some money for it. There's some thought that goes into it, and definitely some obsession. I definitely am obsessive and think a lot about it. So I get excited about it. And I get excited about other people's products. You know, I'm the same way. I love to go eat food. I like to drink, you know, different coffees, different wines, etc. So I think, you know, we're in a renaissance right now. It's going to be really cool over the next few years to see all this great new offerings.
Yeah, I would say too, yeah, it's really important to know what their motivation is. I think there's a lot of people who think like, I'm going to break out of my cubicle and buy a pickup truck and everything will be fine. And then they get into the distilling world and it's tough, and it's, you know, not everything's fine, and you're filling out paperwork and tax forms all over again. And if the heart wasn't there for just the passion of doing it, no matter who's looking, it can end up, you can taste it in the glass. And I think that's something to really look at.
So we've got about 5-10 minutes left. Just love to get questions from any of you. What you wonder about when it comes to craft distilling. Why don't you go ahead?
Woodford Reserve earlier in April proposed to build 12 distilleries on land that I think was reserved for agricultural use. So this whole argument came up: is craft distilling agricultural?
That argument came up in Vermont recently too, with Whistlepig, that tried to sidestep some of the regulatory oversight because they claimed they were an agricultural thing. They had, the transcripts are amazing. So they started getting into, well, what's the percentage of water that's in your whiskey? Then it was a question of, is water agricultural if you take it off your property? And people say, well, all farms take water off their property to water. Should we count that as a percentage against the fact that it's agricultural? It got completely absurd. But I think that we're going to be seeing more and more of that question. And I would argue, and I believe Scott would argue, that it very much is agricultural. From a zoning point of view, you've got some industrial issues as well, dealing with neighbors, but that's a different
I mean,
thing.
Oregon has dealt with that for the wine industry. You know, farms are allowed to have processing sheds. Obviously, there, you know, silos. There's a lot of things that go on a farm that aren't just row crops or whatever. And so, clearly, distilling is a value-added agricultural product. In Oregon, they addressed this years ago with wineries, and they just set a limit that you can, in order to have a winery in agricultural zoned land, they had to have at least 20 acres of grapes, 20 acres under grape. And so they're applying the same to distilleries. So as long as you're growing 20 acres of whatever commodity that you're distilling, you can have a distillery on the land. I don't know how it's working out in other states, but I thought that was a pretty pragmatic.
Definitely going to be a state by state.
Yeah, in Boston it's complicated. Yeah. We have farmers distillers license, but rum is really traditional in the area. We actually buy our cane from much closer than a lot of Caribbean distillers actually get their cane. So it gets really complicated, but I think your question's right as to the craft, like how close are you to that base crop? How connected to you? I mean, I call our sugar chemist all the time. He hates that I have his cell phone number. You know, and are you in the fields? Do you see it? And I think, you know, crushing apples, and your watermelon photos were amazing. And you guys, everything they've done over the last decade has been incredible. So I think that's a good question.
But if you ask a producer of spirits or wine also how much they make, and they don't want to tell you, or they're hedgy about that question, what is that?
Sometimes it can change. I mean, we
if you ask a
expanded, and
producer
then it
of
can be
spirits
misleading.
or
So like
wine,
Christian said, he produces twice what he
much they
does
make,
because he's doing
and
the
they
responsible thing and laying down
want to
casks.
tell you, or
You
they're
know,
hedgy
we
about that
produce
question?
probably 100,000 bottles a year. Sometimes it can change. I mean, we expanded, and then it can be misleading. So like Christian said, he produces twice what he does because he's doing the responsible so when thing and someone laying gets down hedgy, casks. It can be You know, super sketchy.
we produce
probably
Maybe they
100,000
just don't
bottles
know.
a year.
Maybe they just don't know, which is a bigger sign of how connected they are to the actual production.
Storage by aging it, by letting it grow.
Well, it could also be, I
so when
think,
someone gets hedgy, it can
insecurity,
be super
you know,
sketchy.
like, well, we really don't make that.
Maybe they just don't know.
Maybe they just don't know, which is a bigger sign of how connected they are to the actual production.
I think that's a joke.
Yeah.
You know, well, it could also it's be sort of I an think, insecurity. So I've
insecurity
seen, you know, of like, well,
in
we
the
really don't
craft
make that.
world,
We don't a lot of fudging
like tiny
up on numbers.
Oh yeah,
you
what
know,
we
so
sell,
you're-
I don't trust what anyone
yeah.
says. But when there's like, what do they make? That
joke,
could be
you know what I mean?
their
It's
sourcing
like
and
sort
they're
of an
embarrassed
insecurity.
by it.
So
You know,
I've
and for me, it's
seen
all about just be
in the
transparent.
craft
Say,
world,
I source, so I
a
make
lot
this
of
much.
fudging
And sometimes
up
the,
on
you know,
numbers.
Oh
you
yeah,
can
what
look
we
at that,
sell, I don't
and
trust
it
what
is
anyone
still
says.
business.
But
Sometimes-
when there's like, what do they
people
make? That
sometimes
could
wanna
be
know,
their sourcing and
hey,
they're
how much you
embarrassed by
making?
it. You know, and for me,
And
it's all
maybe
about
they
just
have
be
other,
transparent.
ulterior
Say, I source,
motives,
so I make
like,
this
I
much.
want to see And what their sometimes plans are, you know, because you can we're look in the at same that, boat. We do a and lot it of is still a aged business. products. So
And
we
people
may be
sometimes wanna
building
know,
up,
hey, how much
you
you
know,
making
inventory of
and
a
maybe
select
they have
product
other,
that we don't
ulterior
have.
motives,
Like, I want to see what their plans
bottle
are.
out on
because
the shelf
We're in
yet.
the same
And
boat.
if we
We
tell
do a
people,
lot
hey,
of
we're
aged
building this
products.
up, then
So
they can start
we may be
working
building
towards
up.
that.
So I mean, there's you just have to
inventory
take
of a
it.
select product.
It can
that
be
we don't
you know,
have,
like, hey, why don't they just tell you?
a
But
bottle
then
out
again,
on
if
the
you
shelf
go
yet.
to a lot
And
of
if we tell
different
people,
businesses,
hey,
a
we're
lot of
building
different
this
businesses
up,
aren't going to tell
then
you.
they can start,
Well, this is how much our
maybe
sales
working
are.
towards
This is how
that.
much our.
So, I mean,
this is how
there's,
much
you
we
just have to
produce
take
for this
it.
and that.
So
it can be,
you have to
like, hey, why don't they just tell you?
If they're
But then again,
open
if
and
you
honest
go to
about
a lot of
their
different
processes,
businesses, a lot of
they're probably
different
being
businesses are
open
going to
and
tell you
honest about most
well, this is how much
They
our
just
sales
may not
are. This is
wanna
how much
be
our,
direct
this is
and
how
tell
much
you,
we
hey,
produce for this
we do
and
this
that.
many.
So
Okay.
you have to understand it.
Yeah.
If they're open
Well,
and honest
they've
about
brought
a lot
out
of
the
their
big hook.
processes,
They're
they're probably
going to
being
pull us
open
off the
and
stage.
honest about most
Thank you all
They
for
just may
coming
not
out. We're good. If you want to
be
continue
direct
discussion,
and
we
tell
will be
you,
for another few minutes
do
down at the Carousel Bar Okay. from here. We're going to head right down there.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk a little bit
Well,
more.
they've brought out the
Otherwise,
big
I'd
hook.
thank Perfect Puree for us off the stage.
Bringing
Thank you all for coming out. We're good. If you want to continue discussion, we will be for another few minutes down at the Carousel Bar from here. We're going to head right down
Thank you.
there. Thanks for coming out. We're going to talk a little bit more. Otherwise.